Well, good morning, everybody. Here we are. It's already the 5th Sunday of Lent, and it's the first Sunday of spring. And while we've been in this season within the church calendar leading up to Easter, we've been looking at the gospel accounts in a series called As Family We Mourn. And each week we've looked at someone who's dealing with loss in some way, guided by something called the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. Now, our first week in this series, we looked at shock, and we looked at Lazarus' death and the ways in which his family and community mourned. We also looked at the way that Jesus brought hope to the situation and resurrected Lazarus, calling him out of his tomb, even though it had been days since he had passed away. Our second week, we looked at denial in the life of Peter. Now, Peter famously denied that he was one of Jesus' followers and also denied even knowing Jesus while he was gathered around a campfire with strangers during Jesus' trial before the high priests. We talked about how Peter was mourning a vision of the future where Jesus would lead an armed rebellion to topple the Roman occupying force, and how, when the rooster crowed, he was reminded that Jesus had told him this would happen. He was exposed for his lack of faith, and at the same time, by virtue of Jesus having been very specifically correct about what would happen, he was given another reason to believe. Our third week, we looked at anger, also in the life of Peter. We jumped back to an earlier part in the story and examined the moment of Jesus' arrest. Peter, confronted with Judas' betrayal, lashed out quickly, cutting off the ear of one of the men who had come to arrest Jesus. But Jesus restored that man's ear and spoke to Peter about how this was a part of the story God was writing. Last week, we looked at bargaining and the accounts of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Jerusalem at the time. Jesus was brought before him because Pilate was the only one who could pronounce a death sentence. And Pilate, observing how emotionally charged the crowd before him was, could not find anything in Jesus worthy of the death penalty. But he felt compelled to give the people what they wanted to maintain order. He tried a number of different ways to prevent or at least delay the inevitable. But ultimately, Jesus was sentenced to crucifixion. And today we're looking at depression. Now, that's a big, complicated word, and our understanding of it has changed considerably since the stages of grief were first introduced. Today we're really only going to be talking about depressive episodes, responses to events which, while they're similar in some ways, are different than the experiences of ongoing depression. Those are a complex beast that can be tied up in so many different things, like brain chemistry or past trauma or even exposure to sunlight and many other contributing factors. But today we're going to talk about a working definition for what depression can look like as part of a grieving process. And while it may have some similarities to clinical depression, it's not the same conversation. So today, as we look at the Easter story to examine someone's experience of depression as part of the grieving process, we're going to focus on Jesus in Matthew chapter 26. It's the first and only time in this series that we're going to look at the way in which Jesus is mourning. Every other instance of mourning that we have is of somebody around him. And in Matthew 26, we're jumping back again to the garden at Gethsemane. We're looking at the moments of stillness before Jesus is arrested. He and the disciples have traveled to the garden, having just shared that significant meal together. And Jesus goes off to the side, just a little distance away from the disciples, in order to pray. And that's where we join the story, here in Matthew chapter 26, starting with verse 37. Then he took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee with him, and he grew sorrowful and deeply distressed. My soul is overwhelmed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. He walked a little farther and finally fell prostrate and prayed. Father, this is the last thing I want. If there is any way, please take this bitter cup from me. Not my will, but yours be done. And when he came back to the disciples, he saw that they were asleep. Peter awoke a little less confident and slightly chagrined. And Jesus spoke to him, saying, "So you couldn't keep watch with me for just 1 short hour? Now maybe you're learning. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak. Watch and pray and take care that you are not pulled down during a time of testing." With that, Jesus returned to his secluded spot to pray again. Father, if there is no other way for this cup to pass without my drinking it, then not my will, but yours be done. Again, Jesus returned to his disciples and found them asleep. Their eyes were heavy-lidded. So Jesus left them again and returned to prayer, praying the same sentiments with the same words. Again, he returned to his disciples. Well, you are still sleeping. Are you getting a good long rest? Now the time has come. The Son of Man is just about to be given over to the betrayers and the sinners. And those words bring us up to the point that we've examined in previous weeks. And there's a lot to unpack here. And I think that this morning we're going to start with the location. They've traveled to the garden at Gethsemane, which is notable for a few reasons, one of which is very practical, and one of which is very symbolic. The practical reason is that this was a place that they had spent a considerable amount of time this week. Judas would have been able to find them here rather quickly because it had been a part of their routine while they'd been in Jerusalem. The symbolic reason why this place was notable has to do with how they would have entered the garden. The Gospel, according to John, specifically notes that to enter the garden, they would have crossed over the brook Kidron, and this small rivulet of water would have contained the runoff from the temple. And on this day, at this time of year, the blood from the sacrifice of thousands of Passover lambs would have been visible in that runoff, in that brook. So as they entered the garden, the idea of sacrifice would have been apparent, especially to Jesus, who was preparing himself as a sacrifice to atone for the sins of the world. So now we arrive, and Jesus breaks off from the large group with a few trusted disciples. And then he steps away from them just a little bit. And the Gospel, according to Matthew, describes his feelings at this time with the following phrases: sorrowful and deeply distressed, overwhelmed with grief to the point of death. And the Gospel, according to Mark, uses similar language: distressed and filled with sorrow. It records Jesus' words as saying, "My heart is so heavy, I feel as if I could die." And Luke speaks about his anguish and his sweat coming like drops of blood. And you could look at Jesus' prayer and focus on how he could appear to be in the bargaining stage, asking God if there's any other way for this to happen. But in each of the gospel accounts, the writers show that in that same breath, Jesus accepts God's will over his own. This passage really stands out for the overwhelming emotion that Jesus is experiencing. And commentators have pointed out here that the Greek words are an expression of the greatest sorrow imaginable, and that the English translation doesn't really capture the strength of it. It's been described as a violent emotion. And there are so many moments throughout the Gospels where Jesus is calm, even though he's facing incredible circumstances. And the depth of emotion he experiences here, and the visibility of it in his words and actions, is notable. And it's worth mentioning that we're talking about Jesus experiencing a depressive episode. And based on the language used to describe his emotional state, the way that he describes his experience, I think it's fair. But it's also worth noting that the experience that he's going through, we see it unfolding over a matter of hours. And for a lot of people, that's a much shorter timeline than their reality. So as Jesus prays, I already mentioned that he's simultaneously asking for a way out, for any other possibility, and accepting God's will. Humanity needs to be saved from their sins. But does this have to be the way that it happens? And as much as Jesus feels that, he acknowledges that it's not about what Jesus the Son wants. It's not about his experience, but it's about the larger story that God is writing. And there's really only one way that this next chapter can be written. In looking at Jesus' experience here, I think it's fair to attach a couple of words to what he's feeling. I think that his emotional state, his depressive episode, can be defined by his feelings of being lost and alone. He wants there to be another way. He doesn't know what it might be. He doesn't see that there's any possibility for it. But that's what he wants. He feels lost. He doesn't know the way out. He's just stuck. He also feels alone. And we see that in his reaction to the disciples' inability to stay awake with him. But Luke, in his gospel, shows us something really interesting. In Luke 22, verse 43, we read that before his most intense prayer, a messenger from heaven arrives in order to give Jesus strength. Yet Jesus is still experiencing deep sorrow. He's still in distress. The presence of the messenger doesn't remove those feelings of being lost and alone that Jesus is experiencing. You could say that Jesus is objectively not alone. His disciples are very close at hand, even though they're asleep. But here's a messenger from heaven that is with Jesus, there to give him strength. Yet, Jesus continues to feel that he is on his own. And it's true that what Jesus is about to experience, nobody will experience with him. But in this moment, Jesus is surrounded by people who love him and even has a supernatural support. And in this moment, it's not enough. And that's what makes depression so painful, because it isn't necessarily a reflection of the outward reality. There are very real things that contribute to it, that can help you to understand it, that can paint a picture for you of how and why it's happening. But those things don't change the thoughts and emotions that you're going through. You can be standing in the middle of a crowd of people and feel alone. You could be holding a map of where to go next, step-by-step directions, and feel lost. And we don't see evidence that this was a continual state for Jesus. It seems to be an incredibly specific episode tied to this time in the garden. It seems to be a reaction to the loss that he's going to experience. And I would love to distill it down to a simple sentence, but it's an entirely unique and fairly complex thing that Jesus is experiencing here. Because scholars agree that Jesus' feelings and actions are not so much about the physical sacrifice. It's not about being nailed to the cross. He seems to be anticipating the moment where he atones for the sin of the world. The moment where he is on the cross and cries out, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which translates to, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The source of Jesus' torment, of this depressive episode, is that he sees the loss of his relationship with his Father. The moment at which they are going to be separated, when he takes the sins of the world on his shoulders and he feels his Father forsaking him, where he feels the wrath of God in response to the world's sin, where he feels God turn from him. And those were things that he had never felt before, always being a part of his Father, always being in such close fellowship. And Jesus would have known that he would conquer death, that he would ascend and be at the right hand of his Father in heaven. He would have known that the darkness of that moment on the cross would not last. But he also knew that that moment of darkness was coming. So he feels lost. He feels alone because things are going to change and it's going to be intensely painful. It's going to be so painful that the pain intrudes. It comes early and weighs on Jesus here in the garden before it's time. He knows what's going to happen. He doesn't need to feel lost. He's there with his disciples. He doesn't need to feel alone. A heavenly messenger is even sent to strengthen him, but his feelings of anguish remain. Depression and even depressive episodes are frightening because they don't give way in the face of reason. So how do we respond when we see these moments in our own lives, when we see them in the lives of our family, of our friends? Well, this passage gives us an example of what not to do. Don't fall asleep. As much as it is possible to do so, stay awake, keep watch, stand beside, and pray for those around you who are struggling. What they're going through, what they're experiencing, it doesn't abide by the rules in your brain for how things should go. So you aren't going to be able to fix it. You aren't going to be able to change things with the flip of a switch. What you can do is offer concrete and regular reminders that they are not alone, that you're only a few steps away, and that you're keeping watch and praying. If we pay attention to Jesus' experience here, we see that the deep feelings don't appear to continue beyond the end of this passage. And it seems like a quick transition to us. All that we can read is that Jesus, frustrated with his disciples, keeps returning to prayer and keeps praying the same thing. And it would be a beautiful gift if we could read here that Jesus was set free from this depressive episode by this specific and repeatable action. But it's not so simple. The best that we can guess is that over time, as he prayed, as he continually worked to focus on God's will over his own, as the messenger of the Lord was there giving him strength, as he was surrounded by his disciples, even though they were sleeping, that Jesus' thoughts and feelings changed enough that he could continue. They changed enough that he could get up off the ground. They changed enough that he could take that next step. Depression, even depressive episodes, so complicated. It's such an interior thing. And we cannot know the mind and emotions of another person. We barely understand our own. And that may be overstating it. These feelings, these emotions, this reality, it doesn't have a simple answer. And so the best that we can offer is something that's complex on its own. We can stand beside, near, adjacent to those we love, whether they see us there or not. We can call out to God to send a messenger from heaven, whether it will bring enough strength to stand or just enough strength to continue to cry out in anguish. We can point towards hope, even if things feel so dark that no light can shine. The one thing we cannot do is flip a switch. There's no quick and easy solution, and there's no solution that involves one person carrying the burden on their own. And in this particular moment in history, we seem to have woken up to the reality of mental health concerns, and especially depression, in our communities and our families. Fragile support systems have been challenged by a global pandemic, and feelings of isolation are more concrete than at any other time in recent memory. And there are people in our community, in our family, who are hurting. So how can we care for them? I think even asking that question goes a long way, because it's an exercise in coming alongside. It's a signifier that we will not fall asleep on our watch because we don't want to add to the feeling of being alone. The answer to that question, how can we care for the people in our family who are walking through depression, is not easy. I don't have a complete answer to it. I know that it's complex, and I know that it's more than I can handle on my own. I know that I don't want people to feel lost. I know I don't want them to feel alone. And there are things that I can do that should rationally reduce those feelings. But I know that depressive episodes aren't really a rational experience. So what I'm left with is calling out to God, asking for His strength. I need it for myself. I need His wisdom. I need to surrender to His will. But I can also ask for it for those that I know who are struggling, those who are feeling overwhelmed, who are feeling lost and alone. We're going to sing now, and as we do, I invite you to pray. Pray the words that Jesus prayed in that garden. Not my will, but yours. And add on to those words, not my strength, but yours. Not my plans, but yours. Not my understanding, but yours. Not my hope, but yours. We cannot fix someone else. We cannot carry them through. We can stand beside them, though. We can support them. We cannot be guided by our own desires or our own egos. It can't be about us. We need to move to the sidelines and let Jesus be the center. We need to let him guide us as we love those in our community. We need to let him carry us as we stay awake. We need to let him strengthen us as we pray. It's an incredibly complex concern. It's too complex for us. So we need Jesus. We need Jesus to be our center so that we can see how to stand with those that we care for who are walking through this dark time. We need Jesus to be our center. Let's sing together.